Hi, it's Phil Smy again, and this week we're going to review a book that'll be bold. That is, the book is actually called Bold, and it's by Peter Diamandis. Exponential entrepreneurism, and that doesn't have anything to do with the entrepreneur himself becoming exponential, but it's about taking advantage of exponential technology. According to Diamandis, technology, when it becomes exponential, qualifies something as the 6 Ds, and these are the stages that exponential technology goes through and becomes a market effect. So the first of these 6 Ds is digitization. And throughout the beginning part of this book, Diamandis uses Kodak as the example and the digital camera. So we'll do the same thing because it's easiest. So digitization, of course, when pictures went from a chemical process to a digital process. And this is important because as soon as something gets on the digitization path, it becomes subject to Moore's law, and that is the constant doubling, exponential doubling of the technology. The second D is deception. This is when people don't really understand how important the digitization was.
You have no idea what I'm capable of.
And this happened in Kodak's case because the first cameras were so incredibly poor, like 0.01 megapixels, which must have just looked like, digital art or something like that. They just said, well, this isn't going to have any effect on our business at all. So that's deception. But the third D comes along, and that's disruption. And that's when there starts to be an impact. And that's when people start to say, oh, you know what, these digital cameras, maybe they're still a bit of a toy, but they're interesting, and they're starting to affect the actual market for practical cameras. And then things jump the... not jump the shark, kind of jump the divide, and they're on their way. So we've gone through the digitization, the deception, the disruption, and we're on the path to actually taking over the market. And the first thing is the demonetization, and that is when there's no longer money involved. And Diamandis' example of Kodak, this is a really interesting step when he talks about how it used to be the time, like when I was a kid, when you took a picture and you had to develop a whole roll of film and you didn't know if any of these pictures were any good or not. You still paid for it. You still paid Kodak. But as soon as you had a digital camera, you could actually see which pictures were good or not. And so the amount of money you spent, if you ever printed those pictures, was dramatically less because you only printed the good ones. Then the next step is dematerialization. And that's when the actual physical device goes away, which is kind of weird when you think about it. But Diamandis' explanation is that, we had this time where we went from cameras to digital cameras, whereas now it's actually just your phone. There isn't even a digital camera anymore. Everything's just built into your phone. And finally, we have democratization, and that is when this technology is available to everybody. Because you have people in the middle of Mongolia who have an iPhone and can take a picture, whereas, 25 years ago probably, even taking an actual picture was very difficult. So it's an incredible change. The digital camera is a great example from when it was invented, maybe 40 years ago, not even, till now when the whole camera industry is basically gone except for a few edge dwellers. So the 6 Ds was part 1 of that book. Part 2 of this book was really understanding how something called the hype cycle can benefit to you as an entrepreneur.
Don't believe the hype. Don't believe the hype.
And a hype cycle is what kind of every invention goes through. And I'm going to use like the jetpack as an example here. You have the trigger. You have this thing where somebody said, oh, you know what? Somebody's invented a jetpack, or a jetpack is invented. So that gets started. And then we have this huge peak of inflated expectations. That's where we think, like I thought when I was a kid, that in 20 years everyone's going to have a jetpack and we're going to fly around. Then the trough of disillusionment comes, and that is where everybody goes, oh, you know what? There actually aren't going to be any jetpacks, and everything's very low, even though technology is there, or drone technology. But then things come out of this trough of disillusionment and onto the slope of enlightenment. Don't ask me who came up with these names. I didn't write that part down. So you have the slope of enlightenment, where things start to actually be developed using that technology. And finally, you have the plateau of productivity where actual products are being made. And there's a huge time between that trigger and especially the peak of expectation and the plateau of productivity. And for an entrepreneur, the really important part is when we jump out of this trough of disillusionment, when everybody thinks that technology is worthless, and we get on to this slope of enlightenment where actual commercial products are being made. That transition from disillusionment to enlightenment, again, I'm sorry about the words, that's when it's really, really important for an entrepreneur to get involved. And that's a huge market opportunity. A great example is 3D printing. You know, when 3D printing was invented, everybody thought, okay, we're going to have like Star Trek. And when that didn't happen, people were very disappointed. And almost nobody recognized when 3D printing started to actually catch on. And that moment, you know, was about 5 years ago or maybe 7 years ago when we jumped from the trough to the slope and production started to happen. And now, of course, we're into the plateau where we see 3D printing being done everywhere. In the book, Diamandis tries to talk about 5 areas that he sees great exponential growth going to happen in the near future. Number 1 was networks and sensors, and that's the Internet of Things, let's call it that, where, you know, we have sensors everywhere. Our houses become very aware of their temperature and things like this, and our fridges become smart fridges. Infinite computing, artificial intelligence, robotics, and synthetic biology. You know, that's where you inject robots into your bloodstream. Those are his 5 areas that he thinks things are going to really happen. And so we kind of jump out of the beginning part of the book at the end of that. And this is where my issue starts to come. I think the interesting part about guidelines for entrepreneurs and the history of it is quite interesting to me. But the rest of the book, you know, there's a trough in the middle here, to take his word. The trough in the middle, for me, I just don't think he's in touch with reality. For me, it seems like his idea of an entrepreneur, like Google is an entrepreneur, or, you know, a bunch of rich white kids from Harvard are entrepreneurs. And I think even though he runs something called the Singularity University, to me, this book feels ultra-American and kind of elitism being the new normal. And, you know, there's billions of people around the world who bold, and the concepts in bold are just way ahead of them, too far ahead of them. And I think that if he thinks that these people are going to be able to grab onto this, maybe he's wrong or I'm wrong. Probably I'm wrong. But, you know, I'd like to see more talk about how these technology advancements and opportunities are available to people in developing worlds. I mean, he talks about, you know, how the motivation is no longer money. And he says, you know, money, it now appears, is only an effective motivator until our basic biological needs are met with little left over for discretionary spending. So there's a lot of people who don't have that. People who don't have their basic biological needs met. So they're not going to be bolding anytime soon. There's a couple sections on crowdsourcing, getting back to those of us who are fortunate enough, you know, to be entrepreneurs and have opportunities available to us. There is some great stuff in this book about crowdsourcing and crowdfunding. And for me, the practical part, that was the most inspiring. You know, he talks about how to do good crowdsourcing and how to do good crowdfunding. And both of those are really good. But the book, for me, it just left kind of it was too fantastic. It almost read like science fiction for me.
Whatever that lunch was, it was certainly delicious.
Simply some of Robbie's synthetics.
He's your cook, too?
He even manufactures the raw materials.
And he's talking about things like the X Prize, where people make spaceships and stuff like this. And it just really sounds like science fiction. It's inspiring in parts, but I don't know if I can recommend the book, unfortunately. I think if somebody did a good summary of the book, that would probably suit most people's needs. And that's true, of course, of most books, but in this one, just kind of left a little bit of a elitist taste in my mouth, which I don't like. Anyway, bit of a mixed review. I review this book because I know it's a really popular book and people are talking about it a lot in entrepreneurial circles. So I hope my review is of some value to you. Please subscribe. Next ones will be more positive, I promise. Well, I don't promise, I hope. And we'll see you soon. Thanks.